Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. I interview incredible people who've dedicated their lives to helping those who've been impacted by trauma. A big thank you to our sponsors and our guests who are supporting this show. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Arani. Arani, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Guy.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Arani is an author and guide whose work weaves depth psychology, somatic awareness, and embodied spiritual practice. She supports women healing the mother wound and seekers integrating transformative experiences through presence, relational care, and respect for the nervous system's pace. Her approach is grounded, trauma-informed, and experiential, emphasizing integration as a lived process rather than a peak moment or conceptual understanding. All right, Arani, just a little bit about you before we get going. Share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I was born at Boulder Community Hospital, and I've lived in Boulder my whole life. When I was 23, I had graduated from college and intended to move to Northern California with a group of friends, but I got a real job. So I stayed and ended up moving up into the mountains above Boulder, and I am very happy here. These mountains are my roots. And so although I've traveled a lot and spent a lot of time in India and South America, Europe, all the places, I have never had the desire to leave the mountains here. So born and raised in Boulder and living in the mountains up above.
All right. So let's start here. How does all this start for you?
Well, my intention for my own life has been sort of unfolding. I think my childhood was very difficult, and the way that I survived it was trying to fit in and be achievement oriented. And so I put a whole bunch of different hurdles, like if only I could graduate from college. Then it was like, if only I could get a law degree. all of these hurdles to try to make myself feel better internally. And at some point I realized that that wasn't actually working, and that the outer kind of goals that I was setting for myself, really every time the bar just got higher, but the healing wasn't actually happening for me. And so I had to take a different approach, if you will.
Okay. That's the big picture here. So we're going to dive in. What was going on?
Well,
you said you had a difficult situation. What was going on to
Yeah.
the extent that you feel comfortable talking about it?
I'm happy to share. My parents were married when they were very young. My mom, it was in the early 60s, and my mom got pregnant with my older brother. And, by the time she was 17, she had a baby and dropped out of high school, which was kind of expected then in a way. Then I came along 2 years later. By the time I was 4, my parents were divorced. They were young, alcohol, all the things that were happening in the 60s. And I lived with my mom for probably a short time, maybe 6 months. And then she ran off to Dallas, leaving me with my father and older brother. So that was the first kind of primary abandonment, if you will. And then I was deeply affected by that, because I thought that it was my fault. The morning before she left, I had been crying because my socks didn't match, and she was trying to get me to kindergarten. And there was some part of me that thought she left because I'm a bad person. I took that on as my own kind of, if there's something wrong with me, if you will, that core belief. And um, so that was traumatic. I had nightmares. I wet the bed. I stopped speaking. For first and second grade, I went to a speech therapist, all of
Oh.
that. We moved to another school, kind of starting over, but my dad then met a woman and remarried, and she was a very unkind woman, if you will. She was deeply insecure and deeply angry. I wouldn't go so far as, if you were going to ask me for a diagnosis, I would say she was a narcissist, and possibly a malignant narcissist. But anyway, so she took kind of control of our family and isolated us from our cousins and uncles and aunts and kind of grandparents, and created this kind of place where I became the scapegoat of the family, which was harrowing. I never felt safe at home. If I did something wrong, I never knew what exactly it was that would
Hmm.
kind of trigger her. But then she would go for weeks without speaking to me. Or at one point, she had my older brother and I tested because she was telling everybody that we had, and I know this is a politically incorrect word, but it's the word she used toward me when I was like in the third grade, which, you're retarded. You need, you know, so it just went on and on. And then, of course, the test came back that we weren't retarded, but that was never amplified. It was always, anyway, I was the scapegoat. And so that environment was hostile, and it felt extremely unwelcoming and unsafe. Um, And so that was kind of the childhood trauma, if you will. And um, I had core beliefs that I was unlovable and that I was bad and that I was stupid and all of these things. And yet at school, I was scoring really high on the tests, and I was really athletic. I spent a lot of time outside running around. So there was kind of a disconnect in a way
Hmm.
between my inner reality of what I thought was true and what I was actually presenting to the outside world. And then that became my way of surviving. It was just like,
Hmm.
it doesn't feel good inside, but if I can make it, if I can achieve on the outside, well, at least I'm not disappearing. Or I don't know how to say it, but I think you
Yeah.
understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. So, how do things unfold for you as you get older through high school? How are you managing? I guess this is how you're managing one way. As things evolve, do you go to college? What are you thinking? I want to be X, Y, or Z. I want to get into how do you start thinking about or feeling into becoming a guide and an author and writing about these topics?
That was, I guess that's a reflection of my own healing path, if you will. And high school was difficult because my mom had moved back from Dallas. I moved in with her, but she didn't have the boundaries. She wasn't able to show up as a parent. It was more like we were roommates. That was a whole nother kind of abandoning wound. And at some point, I went into a deep depression, and I realized that I needed structure. So um, I moved back in with my dad and stepmother, which was a whole other very difficult thing, but it was a survival um, decision. And from there was no support for me going to college because everyone thought that I was just really um, not capable, if you will. So when I graduated, I took a year off and got a job, got my own apartment. All of my friends were going off to college. And at some point, there was some inner voice that said, I have got to get my college degree. I was working in a ski shop. I was really doing a good job. It was obvious that I was very capable. And I took myself into the admissions office, and from there, I paid my way through college. And that was like my
Wow.
first kind of hurdle. I thought, I'll feel so much better. My self esteem is going to skyrocket if only I get that college degree, right? So, and it did it. It was helpful. And college was challenging. I think I had episodes of depression throughout, but it was just like one foot in front of the other. And when I got my degree, um, it it was an accomplishment, but it didn't change the way I felt about myself internally. I got a job. I got married to an older man who already had 3 kids, and I think that was my way of, you know, finding finally safety and a place where I kind of had this sudden
Hmm.
kind of intact family. And I was a great step parent, and I was doing the brownies and, you know, all the soccer games and all of
Everything
this.
you're
And
supposed to do.
yeah, exactly.
Let
I
me
was really
interject
showing
here
up for them.
for a
And
second,
in
Arani.
a way that was healing for me because I had never had that. But it wasn't enough. And I set another hurdle, which was if only I had a graduate level degree. And so I was looking around, and um, I decided to go to law school. And so I got a degree in law.
Wow. Okay, hang
And
on. Let me just Arani, let me interject here for a second. So up to this point, have you sought out any kind of therapy or quote unquote help for,
yes,
okay, what did that look
that's a
like?
good point. When I was in high school, when I moved, when I was living with my mom, I was really in a I realized that I needed help. So that was I I sought out therapy, and I was working with a therapist at the end of my senior year just to get through high school because uh I just was so shut down. So that was kind of the first help. And she was just helping me. Okay, you need structure. How would it feel? Move back in with dad and Katie. Just get out of this. So that was really helpful. Then in college, I had a therapist for about a year and a half that I was working with. And that was also really helpful and supportive. And it basically was just having someone kind of say, you're, what I needed to hear at that time was, you're okay. You're not crazy. You are having depression, and it's an affective disorder that's caused by all of the stress and trauma that you've experienced in your young life, that kind of thing, rather than, oh my God,
Yeah.
I'm insane and this is a never ending suffering kind of thing. So that helped define what was actually happening. And um, then throughout those years of that marriage, I also sought therapy. And it was never long lasting. It was always like I would wait until I hit
Hmm.
a a downward kind of spiral and think, okay, I need help, and then I'd get therapy. I tried antidepressants a few times, um, anything to just keep myself um, alive and afloat, if you will, and functioning. Um, but when I was 30, I started long distance running. I had my law degree. I was working for legal aid, which is an extremely stressful kind of law practice because you're dealing with people who are being evicted or domestic, on the civil side, domestic abuse, kidnapping, family law matters that are very difficult. And that that was also part of my um, giving of myself to feel better about myself, but it
Hmm.
also taught me so much about human nature and how um, resilience actually is alive in people.
Hmm.
But I think the first kind of awakening was I started long distance running. I decided to train for a marathon that led to a few kind of mini triathlons. And during some of my long runs, I would get into that zone, if you will. They call it the runner's peak. And I could feel this different possibility within my being. I was
Wow.
present. I was, every the mind stopped racing and trying to get ahead or fall behind, and I was just in this zone and at peace with myself, and I recognized that this was a possibility within me, and that it didn't have to only happen when I was running, that it was something that I could actually
Mm-hmm.
cultivate. So that started my journey, with meditation and spirituality, if you will. I understood that, that this possibility was, in essence, my true nature somehow on those long runs, and I longed for that. I longed to not always be kind of striving to please or giving myself away or unable to set boundaries for fear of abandonment, all of those kind of childhood adaptive patterns that actually helped me survive. I'm very grateful for them, but they weren't working anymore, if you will.
Right.
So then I started a journey of meditation. And as you start to kind of change your lens of what feels right for you, then the people in your life start to shift too, right? And a lot of friends dropped away. I got divorced, had to kind of start over.
Mm.
And so that was the beginning of my actual healing journey. And I think it's fair to say that I, the therapists that I saw early on were super helpful. And it just felt like a band-aid, like, because then there
Mm-hmm.
would be another trigger and then I would fall right back into those same symptoms because I truly hadn't healed what was underneath. I was addressing what, the surface problems, more or less, how to function. So I, through word of mouth, I met an elder therapist who was also a spiritual teacher, spent most of his adult life in India. And it was so funny because my first session with him, he said, "Well, tell me about yourself," kind of like we're doing here. And when I finished, instead of saying, which is the, I appreciate the therapist, I'm not knocking therapy at all, which is like, "Oh my God, poor you, your childhood, how traumatic." He just looked at me with these really wise eyes and said, "Wow, why did you choose those parents?" And I was like, "What?" My eyes probably got really big, and I think I was a bit offended. But that became a koan for me in
Mm.
my journey because ultimately it set me free of the idea that I was the victim
Mm-hmm.
of anything in my life, that ultimately this self responsibility, like, I chose this, this is my path. And then you think, okay, well, why did I choose this? It's something that I can heal. And when I heal this, I'm also healing. I didn't know this then. This is hindsight. I should clarify, but it was also very healing for my mom and I think for my lineage as well. So
Well,
that's kind of
that's a
the,
very interesting response. Obviously, why did you choose those parents? Um, and I mean, I think a lot of people, you know, might have a response to that, of course, like
yeah,
you did. But you said, well, that kind of switch things around or flip things around such that I could take responsibility for it and then begin my healing. But healing can happen from any perspective, right?
absolutely.
In a sense. So what strikes me about you, Arani, is your insight into everything that transpired and your experiences is growing up and the trauma involved, but they're all at these specific stages. And I think epitomized with your running, there seem to pop up these bright sunshine moments where you get to see like your essence and your power and your strength come through. And you ran, not to make a little pun here, but you ran with it, right? You took it. And those seem to be really important triggers for or impetuses for your healing, which is really, really cool. So let's kind of move forward a little bit. When do you decide I'm going to be an author? When do you switch into this like maybe I can be a guide. And what does that mean to you to be a guide?
Well, my my journey, I never set out to be a guide. Um, and I think we should be clear when we're talking about a guide. Um, we're talking about somebody who sits with someone in presence. That's how I would define it. What happened for me is I got to to start to work and help support a shaman in South America. I started doing sacred plant medicine down there, and he asked me to support. And so eventually that led to me bringing people down on 2 week sacred plant medicine, what we call dietas, that healing process. And there was, when you're bringing people, there's an entry point where you're talking to the people and making sure they're ready and they understand the experience that they're signing up for, in essence. And then there's an exit point where you want to make sure you're available for them as they're coming back into the real world. So for me, it was just a natural part of being in service to this work, which is a tradition that's thousands and thousands of years old. And so I started having sessions with these people before preparation, setting intention, making sure they were grounded and aware of understanding, how to breathe under pressure, like simple things like that, really. But, and then on the outer, helping them land and ground. And as I was just meeting with these people who were friends or fellow travelers, or people who I was bringing to the work, um, the word of mouth kind of uh, happened. And then people started reaching out and saying, "Hey, I've heard from so and so that you're doing sessions, and I'd like a session." And and so from there, I thought, oh, I was still practicing law part time. I had an estate planning practice, but was really enjoying these sessions of just being with people and holding space and allowing them to kind of. I think that abiding presence is really the most important medicine people can receive in their process. It's like somebody is not trying to fix or change them, but just being with them and allowing them to hold whatever they're holding and share what is surfacing without judgment. So that was my initial approach, and people kept coming, and so I thought, well, I could use some tools. Many of my dearest friends are therapists. My partner, my beloved, is a therapist. I have many friends who are SE therapists. I've been in deep processes, path of love retreats, staff path of love retreats. Many of my friends are path of love leaders, and all of the things. So I have like this kind of random bag of tools, and I heard about Gabor Mate's Compassionate Inquiry year-long training, and I thought, oh, maybe that's what I need to do. And I thought, well, I'm not a therapist. I had actually thought about going back to school and getting a master's, but at that point, I felt like it didn't resonate. It seemed like a logical mind
Mm-hmm.
solution to a problem, but it didn't land in my body. So I took the year-long compassionate inquiry training, and in that training, I got in through the fact that I'm a Kundalini yoga teacher. You have to be a professional, so I had a life coach certificate in Kundalini yoga. Most of the people in that training are therapists,
Mm-hmm.
but so in the year-long training, it was like all of these tools that I had kind of scrambled in my bag became cohesive and
Mm-hmm.
made sense. So from there, I started offering the compassionate inquiry sessions, um, officially, if you will.
Okay.
And from
Let me
there, oh,
uh,
go ahead. You
hang
can
on.
go
Let me pause here for a second.
ahead.
So you mentioned the abiding presence and how important that was. When did that become clear to you? How important that was? That ingredient.
Well, I think it was obvious to me from the get-go because I'm coming from a perspective of my understanding of meditation. And so since I wasn't coming in as a therapist, I never had the inclination to try to use tools that I didn't have. What I had was my my deep committed meditation practice. And so that's what and when I was sitting with the people seeking integration, that's what I had to offer. And then, like I referred to all of those scrambled tools, naturally, the people coming to integration would want to say, well, I'm trying to figure this out, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And I would say that I wouldn't say this, but my understanding was all of this is the mind trying to define and make sense of possibly on something that's unknowable. So my natural inclination was to bring them into a state of more attuned presence, if you were, and just instead of trying. And so I would say, this is your mind. You're trying to figure all of this out, but you have other intelligence centers, if you will. And this comes from the Kundalini yoga training and the Eastern teachers that I worked with. You have other intelligence centers that are probably more uh, able to integrate than
Hmm.
this periphery mind. And so working with people to tap into their navel center and open their heart center, the emotions, allow the subtle neutral mind to actually have connection to those. That's all that's all part of meditation, if you will.
Hmm.
So I guess I understood that was my role from the get-go, that I wasn't trying to fix or change anybody, that I was trying to share with them my understanding of how I was able to integrate. Because of course at times I had the scrambling mind, but I knew that if I could go into my deep breath work and just be, that the scrambling mind would stop. And on some cellular level, the answer was already there. Not that it was,
Hmm.
quote, an answer, but that sense of, okay, you know,
Right.
this
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. I love that. That resonates a lot with me, and I think with a lot of other, you know, therapists, licensed therapists, or people who call themselves or actually therapists. It gets to a point, and sometimes it takes a long time for I think therapists to realize that. You know, just what you said. It's not always easy, but let's kind of. I want to, as we kind of wind down here, I want to kind of talk about your books. You've written four. Let's pick one and share with us when you decided to write it. How? Why?
Well, I've only written two,
Okay.
and the I wrote. Okay, actually, that's not true. I wrote a book on integration when I was, and I'll be really quick with this. When I was starting to sit with people coming with me for integration, one of the things that I saw happening was they're trying to figure it out in their mind and they need tools. And so I actually had an agenda. It's like, do your homework. Here's a meditation, here's a all of the things. But I wrote it from the perspective of a kind of a life coach, yoga teacher. And I didn't talk at all about um, psychedelics because at that time I really wanted to still remain under the radar. I took that book off the market because it wasn't my voice, actually. It was just like very kind of clever. And then as I completed my compassionate inquiry training and people started to come to me for compassionate inquiry, I noticed over and over again that all of my sessions with women were circling around the mother wound And
Mm.
so I had a session with a woman who just wanted to explore why she wasn't sleeping, for instance. And then we came to a place in her past where she realized that when she was an infant, her mother was always waking her up to make sure she was still breathing. And I'm like, okay, there's another example of the mother wound. So I thought, I'm going to focus my CI practice on this mother wound.
Mm.
Obviously, I have my own experience of healing that. And in the course of that, I decided to send out a little email that basically said, I'm going to focus my practice on this. If you could write a testimonial with some of the women I'd worked with. And that led to an editor of a publisher contacting me and saying, I want to talk to you about a book. And so I initially signed up to write a book on the mother wound, which I call the mother ache. And in the course of those negotiations, I met with the publisher and he said, we're really curious about your integration book. Would you consider rewriting it? What would that take? Because it's an important topic, right? I mean, psychedelics are exploding, but if people don't have the tools or the resources, the interior resources, well, so I said yes. And so I wrote the 2 books. I signed a contract for 2 books, and they suggested I do the integration book first, and then the mother ache book is coming out next month sometime.
So
So
who's the mother ache for?
the mother ache, it's I'm very passionate about this actually. The mother ache is for all women. It's for all mothers. It's for all daughters, really. And it's written from the understanding that there is no such thing as a perfect mother. When an infant is an infant and their caregiver is trying to meet their needs, that's not always possible. And so if let's say the baby is crying because it wants to be fed and the mother isn't feeding it because the doctor said feed it on a schedule, all well intended, but the baby gets the message, for instance, maybe a core belief starts to develop that my needs aren't important. So they shut down their disconnect from the body, disconnect from those internal signals, if you will. So regardless of whether you have a really difficult relationship with your mother or a healthy relationship with your mother, in order to survive our early childhoods, we disconnect from our own internal cues in one way or another. And then the adaptive patterns come. I'm pleasing, I'm, I'm a perfectionist, whatever it is. And so the book is teaching about that I tell the story of my own journey with my mother, which is a very actually healing story. And it's honoring the mother. So we're looking at it from not just the fact that my mother was abusive to me, but also what did my mother experience in her life that would have
Mm.
caused this kind of rupture within her that then she couldn't show up for me in the way that I needed. So it's lineage based, and the metaphor that I use is weaving a basket, because
Mm.
the healing occurs through kind of honesty.
Intergenerational. Okay. We'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Arani, pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.